The shotgun blast echoed off the canyon walls like a thunderclap from God himself, and in the space of a single heartbeat, everything Eleanor Voss had ever planned for her future shattered into smoke and screaming horses. It was the autumn of 1874, and the Arizona Territory was still a place where a person's life could turn on the edge of a single bad decision, or the malice of men who had never bothered learning the difference between want and right. Eleanor had boarded the Butterfield Overland stage in Tucson 3 days prior, carrying with her a leather satchel filled with letters of introduction, 2 carefully folded dresses, a small journal her mother had pressed into her hands at the station, and a strongbox belonging to the Prescott Mining Consortium that the company had paid the stage line handsomely to deliver. She was 22 years old, recently educated at a school back east that had given her proper penmanship and an appreciation for literature, and she was traveling to Prescott to take a position as a schoolteacher. She had believed, in the quiet confidence of youth, that she had planned for every possible contingency. She had not planned for Dark Canyon. The stage had entered the narrow passage just as the last thin orange light was bleeding out of the western sky. The canyon walls rose on both sides like the hands of some enormous sleeping giant, jagged and black against the purple dark, and the road through it was barely wide enough for the coach itself, with loose shale sliding down the slopes in little whispering avalanches whenever the iron-rimmed wheels found a loose stone. Tom Briggs, the driver, had told her at the last relay station that the canyon was the one part of the route that made him uneasy. He had said it with the casual familiarity of a man who says such things 100 times and has never yet had reason to regret the saying of them. Now, Eleanor wished she had taken his unease more seriously. The ambush came from both sides at once, which told her immediately that these were not desperate, starving men acting on impulse. They had planned this. They had chosen this place deliberately, in the dark, in the narrowest part of the canyon, where the horses had no room to bolt and the driver had no room to whip them forward. The first shot took out the lead horse, and the second shot sang past Tom Briggs's ear close enough that he later said he felt the heat of it, and he hauled back on the reins with everything he had and brought the lurching, screaming coach to a grinding halt in a cascade of dust and gravel. Eleanor gripped the leather strap above the window and pressed herself back against the hard wooden seat. Across from her, a heavy-set landbroker named Mr. Harlan Duckett had gone completely white and was fumbling uselessly with the buttons of his vest, as if he expected to find a pistol hidden underneath. Beside Eleanor sat a Mexican woman named Consuela Garza, who was traveling to see her sister in Prescott, and who, unlike the landbroker, was entirely silent, her dark eyes watchful and calm in a way that Eleanor found simultaneously frightening and admirable. "Out of the coach!" The voice that called down from the canyon rim was rough and flat, the voice of a man who had given orders like this before and had not been refused. "Every one of you right now, or we put the next one through the driver's chest." The 3 passengers climbed out into the cold, dark air of the canyon floor. Eleanor's boots found the rocky ground, and she straightened herself deliberately, refusing to let her knees shake visibly, though they very much wanted to. The canyon smelled of iron and dust and the sharp chemical bite of black powder. Above them, stars were appearing in the narrow strip of sky between the canyon walls, cold and indifferent and impossibly beautiful. There were 6 of them. Eleanor counted carefully, because her mind needed something specific to hold on to, some task to perform that was not simply the useless exercise of terror. 6 men on horseback, 3 positioned on the road ahead of the stalled coach, and 3 spread out behind it, cutting off any retreat. They wore bandanas pulled up over their faces, but she could see enough of them in the faint starlight to note their horses, their builds, the particular way each man held his weapon. One of them rode a distinctive pale gray horse with a dark mane. One had a blue bandana instead of the red or brown the others wore. One sat his saddle with a pronounced lean to the left, as though an old injury had permanently altered his spine. She did not know why she was cataloging these details. She only knew that her mind was insisting upon it. The leader rode a big black horse, and he did most of the talking. He ordered Tom Briggs down from the box at gunpoint. He ordered the strong box thrown down, and when Tom hesitated, The man with the blue bandana fired a shot into the canyon wall above Tom's head, and Tom threw the box down. It landed with a heavy crash on the shale, and the hasp burst open, spilling papers and 2 cloth sacks that clinked with the particular musical sound of gold coin. The leader dismounted and crouched over it, and in that moment Eleanor made the error she would spend the next several hours regretting. She had her journal in her hand. She did not know precisely when she had picked it up from the seat of the coach. Some instinct, some absurd reflex of preservation for the thing her mother had given her. And her pencil, which she kept tucked inside the journal's cover, slipped free when the leader's man shoved past her, and it clattered on the rocky ground, and she bent reflexively to retrieve it. And when she rose, the leader was looking directly at her. He had cold eyes. Even in the dark, even with the bandana across his face, the eyes above it were pale and cold and entirely without warmth, and they moved over her in a way that made her skin contract. "You're a long way from wherever you came from, schoolteacher," he said. He had seen her books probably, the ones stacked in the string bag beside her satchel. "Pretty thing like you, riding the stage alone." "I am not alone," she said, and was surprised by how steady her voice came out. "There are 3 other passengers and a driver." He smiled with his eyes. It was not a pleasant smile. "That's not what I meant." He looked at her for another long moment, and then one of his men said something low and urgent from behind him, and he looked away, back at the strongbox, and the moment passed, but it left something cold behind it, like a handprint in frost. They took the strongbox, what money the passengers were carrying, Tom Briggs's rifle from its scabbard on the coach box, and the 2 best horses from the team. Then they rode out of the canyon the way they had come, northward into the dark hills, and the sound of their hoofbeats faded, until there was only the wind and the distant sound of something moving in the high rocks above, some night creature going about its own indifferent business. Tom Briggs climbed down from the box and began the grim work of assessing what they had left. 2 horses still in harness, 1 dead on the road. The lead axle on the coach was cracked where it had struck a boulder during the stop. He stood looking at the axle with the expression of a man calculating exactly how bad his situation was, and Eleanor could see the answer in his face before he said a word. "We are not going anywhere tonight," he said. "Not in this rig." "How far are we from the next relay station?" Eleanor asked. 7 miles north, maybe 8. He took off his hat and wiped his forehead, though the night was cold. "I can ride one of the harness horses, get help by morning. But that means the 3 of you stay here with the coach tonight." "In the canyon," Mr. Duckett said, his voice rising in a way that carried no dignity with it. "Unless you want to walk 7 miles in the dark over rock country you don't know," Tom said, not unkindly. He was a practical man, and he was not unsympathetic, but the situation was what it was. "There is a rock overhang about 200 yards back the way we came. I have sheltered there before. You will be out of the wind. I will leave you my spare pistol, and I will be back with men and horses before the sun is properly up." He was as good as his word about the overhang. It was a wide, shallow ledge of sandstone jutting from the canyon wall, and in the dark, Eleanor could smell old campfires there, the ghost of warmth in the stone. She and Consuela arranged the travel blankets from the coach into something resembling a camp, and Mr. Duckett sat against the back wall and said very little, which was, Eleanor found, preferable to anything he might have said. Tom rode out on the harness horse at a steady trot, and his figure disappeared into the canyon darkness, and then there was truly silence. Consuela made a small fire from scraps of dry wood she found along the canyon floor, working with a competence that Eleanor admired enormously. The flames threw orange light against the underside of the rock shelf and pushed back some of the dark, though it seemed to Eleanor that the darkness in Dark Canyon had a particular quality to it, a weight and substance beyond ordinary night. She sat close to the fire and opened her journal, not to write, but simply to hold something familiar. She was trying very hard not to think about the leader's pale, cold eyes, and she was not entirely succeeding. She did not know what woke her when she finally slept. It was not a sound exactly, or rather it was a sound that her sleeping mind registered first as part of a dream, and then, with a lurch of recognition, as something real. A footstep on the shale, deliberate, careful, but not careful enough to be entirely silent on the loose rock of the canyon floor. Eleanor was upright before she was fully conscious, her hand finding the spare pistol Tom had left, and beside her Consuelo was already awake and watching the dark beyond the fire's reach with that watchful stillness that Eleanor had come to understand was not coldness at all, but a particular kind of courage. Mr. Duckett continued sleeping, which would have been remarkable in other circumstances. The fire had burned down to coals and the canyon had gone fully dark, which meant it was somewhere in the deep heart of the night, well past midnight. Eleanor thumbed back the hammer of the pistol, which she had never actually fired, but which she knew in theory how to operate, and she pointed it at the darkness where the sound had come from. "I would put that down if I were you," said a voice from the dark, "before you shoot something you don't mean to." It was not one of the robbers' voices. Eleanor was certain of that immediately, because she had catalogued those voices the way she had catalogued their horses and their silhouettes, and this voice was different in every way that mattered. It was deep, unhurried, carrying a quiet authority that had nothing to do with threat. It was the voice, she thought wildly, of someone who had spent a great deal of time in places where the only listener was the landscape itself. "Come into the light where I can see you," she said, and she was proud again of how steady her voice was. He stepped forward, and the coal glow found him, and Eleanor Voss took a long, slow breath. He was enormous. Not in the way of fat men or men who have grown soft with comfort, but in the way of mountains, in the way of things built by long labor and sustained by hard use. He stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that seemed almost architecturally improbable, the breadth of them wrapped in a heavy buckskin coat that had seen considerable hard weather. His arms, where they emerged from the coat, were thick with muscle, in a way that made Eleanor think of the timber she had watched men haul at a logging operation once, the kind of work that remakes a body over years until it becomes a different kind of machine entirely. His hair was dark brown and fell to his collar, slightly curling at the ends in a way that struck her as unexpectedly human against all that physical enormity. He had a beard, trimmed but not overly so, and a face that was weathered and angular, and, she thought, extraordinarily handsome in the way that things shaped entirely by their environment are sometimes handsome. He carried a long rifle across one arm and a bowie knife on his hip, and he moved with the particular economy of motion that she would later understand belonged to men who had learned to conserve everything in country where waste of any kind cost lives. He looked at the pistol she was still pointing at him, and something that might have been amusement crossed his face, though it was brief and did not condescend. "Eli Cord," he said. "I am a trapper. I came up through the canyon from the south about an hour ago. I saw the dead horse and the broken coach, and I tracked the fire here." He paused. "I also crossed the tracks of 6 horses heading north out of the canyon about 3 hours back." Eleanor slowly lowered the pistol, though she did not uncock it. "You're alone?" "I am," he said. He glanced at Consuela, who was watching him with the same careful assessment he seemed to give everything. "You ladies all right? Anyone hurt?" "We are not hurt," Eleanor said. "They took the strongbox and the rifle and our money and 2 of the horses. Our driver went for help." She heard herself recounting it and marveled at how straightforward the catalogue of disaster could sound when stripped of the terror that had accompanied each item on the list. "He said he would be back by morning." Eli Cord nodded. He unslung a pack from his back that she had not noticed in the dark and crouched by the fire with an ease that suggested he had been crouching by fires in dark places his entire life. He coaxed the coals back to life with a few precise additions of dry wood, and the firelight expanded and found the hard planes of his face and the broadness of his chest and the steadiness of his hands as he worked. "I will stay until morning," he said. It was not offered as a question or as a service requiring negotiation. He said it the way a man states a plain fact about the weather. "That is very kind of you," Eleanor said carefully, "but you need not." "Those 6 rode north," he said, not interrupting her exactly, but with a quiet finality that made the rest of her sentence feel unnecessary. "The road north is the same road your driver is riding. I would rather be here than wondering." He looked up at her then, and his eyes in the firelight were a deep, warm brown, entirely unlike the pale, cold eyes of the leader of the ambush party, and she felt something shift in her chest that she was entirely unprepared for. She sat back down across the fire from him, and Consuela settled too, and the three of them watched the fire for a while, in a silence that was, Eleanor realized with some surprise, not uncomfortable at all. "You are a trapper," she said eventually, "and a hunter. I guide parties through the territory sometimes when the work is honest." He looked out into the dark canyon. "I have been working this range for 5 years. Alone?" The word came out before she could consider it, and she felt immediately that it was too personal a question for a stranger by a fire in a dark canyon, but he did not seem to find it intrusive. He simply considered it for a moment. "Mostly," he said. He did not elaborate, and she did not press. She did sleep again, eventually, though she had not believed she would. When she woke, it was the pale gray of very early morning, and the fire had been carefully maintained through the night. She could see that it was burning at exactly the same steady level it had been when she closed her eyes, which meant he had tended it without waking her. He was sitting at the edge of the overhang, his back to her, watching the canyon. His rifle lay across his knees. The sky in the narrow strip above the canyon walls had gone from black to the particular blue-gray that comes just before a desert sunrise, and it was so quietly beautiful that Eleanor sat for a moment, simply looking at it before she remembered everything else. "They are coming back," he said without turning around. Eleanor was immediately completely awake. "The robbers?" "No." He turned then, and something in his face had relaxed slightly. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. "Tom Briggs. I can hear the horses. 3 of them, maybe 4. He brought men." 20 minutes later, the relay station man arrived with 3 riders and a spare harness horse, and in the chaos of their arrival and Tom's relief, and Mr. Duckett's dramatic account of the previous night's events, Eleanor lost sight of Eli Cord for a moment and was surprised by how sharply she felt the loss. When she found him again, he was standing slightly apart from the activity, speaking quietly with Tom, and Tom was nodding with an expression of increasing gravity. She moved close enough to hear. 6 of them, you say," Tom was saying, heading north up the canyon. "I know this country north of here," Eli said. "There are 3 places a party of 6 could shelter for the night and have water for the horses. I know where they will be." He paused. "I mean to go after them." Tom stared at him. "Alone? Those are dangerous men." "Yes," Eli said simply. Eleanor's heart did something complicated. She said, before she could stop herself, "Why?" He looked at her. In the thin, early light of the desert morning, with the canyon walls beginning to catch the first pink of the sun above, his face was even more striking than it had been by firelight. The strong jaw, the steady eyes, the particular quality of a man who has made peace with solitude, but has not, she thought, made peace with injustice. "Because they will do it again," he said, "to someone else on some other road, and the law in this territory is thin on the ground and slow to arrive." He looked at the broken stagecoach, at the dead horse still lying in the road, at the empty strongbox hasp. "And because a woman was frightened in this canyon last night who did not deserve to be frightened." The directness of it silenced her completely. She had nothing to say to that at all. The relay station man organized a party to repair the coach axle and get the passengers the remaining distance to Prescott by midday. Eleanor helped Consuela pack the travel blankets back into the coach and made sure Mr. Duckett did not have the opportunity to claim her window seat, which he would have done out of pure male reflex if she had given him the chance. She was doing these practical things and simultaneously carrying on an entirely separate internal argument with herself about Eli Cord, about the fact that he was going alone into the canyon after 6 armed men, about the fact that this was absolutely not her concern, about the fact that it felt unavoidably like her concern, about the fact that she did not even know him. She found him loading his pack by the canyon wall, methodical and economical about it, the heavy muscles of his back moving under the buckskin coat as he worked. "How long will it take you?" she asked. He glanced up. "To find them? A day, maybe 2. They are not trying to hide their tracks. They do not think anyone is coming after them." "They are wrong about that." The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest thing to a full smile she had seen from him. "They are wrong about that," he agreed. "I will be at the schoolhouse in Prescott," she said, and then felt the blood come up in her face because it sounded like an invitation, and she had not entirely meant it as one, or rather she had entirely meant it as one and was not prepared to admit that. I mean, I thought you should know, in case the marshal needs a statement from the passengers, in case you... I know where the schoolhouse is, he said quietly. He held her gaze for a moment, and in his eyes was something that was not quite a question and not quite an answer, but something in between, a possibility, held carefully, like a flame cupped against wind. Then he shouldered his pack and his rifle and walked north into the canyon, and the morning light took him, and he was gone. The road to Prescott was long, and the repaired axle creaked with every rut, and Mr. Duckett talked for most of the journey about the indignity of what he had suffered and the compensation he intended to seek from the stage company. And Consuela slept with the magnificent composure of someone who has decided that no amount of annoyance justifies the sacrifice of rest. Eleanor sat at her window and watched the territory roll past, the red rock and the dry grass and the vast blue architecture of the sky, and thought about a man with dark eyes and a long rifle walking north into a canyon, alone, after 6 men who had guns and no conscience. She arrived in Prescott in the late afternoon. It was a proper town by the standards of the territory in 1874, with a central square and a courthouse and a main street of wooden buildings that included a general store, 2 saloons, a hotel, a barber, a gunsmith, and the offices of the Prescott Mining Consortium, outside which several well-dressed men stood talking and looking very unhappy, which Eleanor correctly deduced was related to the non-arrival of their strongbox. The schoolhouse was on the north end of town, a solid building of adobe and timber that had been recently whitewashed, with a small room at the back that had been prepared for the new teacher's residence. It was modest in the extreme. A cot, a washstand, a small iron stove, a window looking out onto the bare yard. But it was hers, and after 3 days on a stagecoach followed by a night in a canyon, Eleanor thought it might be the most beautiful room she had ever seen. She had been in Prescott for 2 days when the marshal came to see her. He was a lean, careful man named Marshal Aldrich, who wore his badge with the weary dignity of someone who has been doing a hard job for a long time and intends to keep doing it regardless. He sat in the schoolhouse with his hat on his knee and asked her about the ambush in careful, methodical detail, and she gave him the careful, methodical account she had prepared: the 6 riders, the positions, the pale-eyed leader, the gray horse with the dark mane, the man with the blue bandana, the man who sat with a lean to the left. He wrote it all down and looked at her with something approaching respect. "You have a good eye, Miss Voss," he said. "I had time to look," she said. He hesitated, then said, "We received word this morning from a rider coming south through Dark Canyon. There's a man up in the hill country, a trapper named Cord. They say he's tracking the party that hit your coach." Eleanor kept her expression carefully neutral. "I see." "He is a capable man," the marshal said, in the tone of someone choosing their words. "He knows that country better than anyone in the territory, but 6 to 1 is—" He paused. "I have 2 deputies and we are riding north tomorrow morning. It would be better for everyone if Mr. Cord would wait for proper law, but I suspect he will not wait." "No," Eleanor said, "I suspect he will not." The marshal left, and Eleanor sat for a while in the schoolhouse with the afternoon light coming through the window and dust motes turning slowly in the golden air. And she thought about Eli Cord in the high country north of Dark Canyon, tracking 6 men through the red rock wilderness, alone, moving through that enormous landscape with the quiet competence she had already seen in him in every small action he had performed by the fire and at the canyon wall. She tried to summon the calm certainty that he would be fine, that a man who had spent 5 years alone in the territory knew what he was doing. The certainty came, but it was followed immediately and inconveniently by the awareness that it mattered to her considerably more than it should, given that she had known him for a few hours in a dark canyon. She opened her student's register and tried to think about arithmetic primers. On the 4th morning after the ambush, Eli Cord rode into Prescott. Eleanor was in the schoolyard with a broom, sweeping out the dust that had accumulated during the days before her arrival, which was a task that required no particular attention, and therefore left her mind entirely free to wander in directions she kept trying to redirect. She saw him come down the main street from the north, and she stopped sweeping and simply watched. He came in on a rangy bay horse that she had not seen before, which she supposed made sense since he had been on foot in the canyon. He was riding with the easy, unhurried seat of someone for whom a horse is simply the most practical way to be somewhere else. Behind the bay, on a lead rope, came 3 horses carrying riders whose hands were bound to their saddle horns. 2 more horses, riderless, followed behind those. She counted and then counted again, and felt something cold and certain settle in her stomach. 5. He was bringing in 5 men. He pulled up in the street in front of the marshal's office, and the town, which had been going about its business, stopped very quickly and went entirely quiet in the way that small frontier towns do when something significant arrives. Marshal Aldrich came out of his office, looked at the 5 bound men, looked at Eli Cord, and said something that Eleanor could not hear from the schoolyard. She found herself walking toward the street without making any particular decision to do so. By the time she arrived, a small crowd had gathered, miners and clerks and the blacksmith and 2 women from the hotel, all maintaining that careful frontier distance that acknowledged something important was happening without committing to a specific reaction. The marshal was talking to Eli in a low voice, and Eli was answering in the same tone, and she noticed that while Eli's clothes were dusty and he looked like a man who had not slept much in 3 days, he was entirely unhurt, and the recognition of this fact produced in her chest a warmth so sudden and specific that she had to stop walking for a moment and simply breathe. "There were 6, the marshal said, slightly louder, and she caught it clearly. "There were 6, Eli agreed. He said nothing more. The marshal held his gaze for a moment, and then looked at the 5 bound men, and then looked away across the street at something that may or may not have required his attention. It was, Eleanor thought, as eloquent a piece of frontier communication as she had ever witnessed. She was standing at the edge of the crowd now, and he saw her. His eyes found her immediately, as though he had known precisely where she was the whole time, which she supposed a man of his particular skills might. Something in his face shifted, that same guarded possibility she had seen in the canyon, but closer to the surface now, as though the intervening days had moved it upward toward the light. He said something to the marshal, handed off the lead ropes to one of the deputies, and crossed the street toward her. He stopped a proper distance away and took his hat off, which was a gesture so unexpectedly formal from a man in buckskin and trail dust that she nearly smiled. His dark hair had been further disordered by 3 days in the open, curling at his collar in the same way she had noticed by the campfire, and the breadth of him was, if anything, more apparent in full daylight. The deep chest, the thick forearms, the hands that were large and capable, and, she noticed, uninjured. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Cord," she said. "You're all right." "I am. And the men. They are in custody." He said it evenly, without elaboration. She wanted to ask him a dozen things. She wanted to ask how he had done it, how a single man had tracked and caught 5 outlaws in 3 days across wild country, what the terrain had been like, whether he had slept at all, what he had eaten, all the practical questions that were standing in for the actual questions she wanted to ask, which were rather less practical. Instead, she said, "The marshal says you know the country north of the canyon better than anyone in the territory." "I know it reasonably well," he said, and there was a modesty in it that was entirely genuine, not performed. A man who actually knows his capabilities, she thought, has no need to advertise them. "Will you—" She stopped, started again. "There's a boarding house on Granite Street, Mrs. Heller's. She keeps a good table. I've taken dinner there the last several evenings." She paused. "I would like to buy you dinner, Mr. Cord, if you are willing to be thanked in that way." He considered this for a moment with the same deliberateness he seemed to bring to everything, and she had the sense that he was not calculating, but rather simply being honest with himself about what he wanted, which was a rarer quality than it appeared. "I need to speak with the marshal for a while yet," he said, "and I would like to wash the trail off me before I sit down at anyone's table." "Of course," she said. "I take dinner at 6. "Then I will be there at 6, he said. He arrived at Mrs. Heller's boarding house at 10 minutes to 6, which was not the timing of a man who was merely being polite about an obligation, and Eleanor noticed this the way she was finding herself noticing everything about him, with a precision that was becoming difficult to explain as simple observation. He had changed out of the trail-worn buckskin into dark trousers and a clean white shirt, and had made some effort with his hair, though it still curled at his collar in a way that she suspected it would, regardless of what efforts were made. Without the heavy coat, the sheer physical reality of him was even more evident. The shoulders that strained slightly at the seams of the shirt, the forearms resting on the table with the easy confidence of a man entirely comfortable in his own body. Mrs. Heller, who was 60 and entirely immune to the sentimental reactions of younger women, nevertheless found reasons to come back to their table 3 times during the meal, which Eleanor found privately satisfying. They ate roasted chicken and boiled potatoes and fresh bread, and it was the best meal Eleanor had eaten in weeks, though she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that the company had something to do with that assessment. He told her about the canyon country to the north, not the chase itself, which he discussed only briefly and practically, but the landscape itself, the red rock mesas and the dry arroyos and the places where a man could stand on a ridge at sunrise and see 50 miles in every direction across a country that was, he said, so big and so old and so entirely indifferent to human presence that it had a clarifying effect on the mind. "You love it," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her across the table. "I have lived in it for 5 years," he said. "I suppose that amounts to the same thing. Did you come from somewhere else, before the territory?" "Missouri," he said. "My father had a farm. I worked it for 3 years after the war." He paused. "I was not built for farming." She smiled. "No," she said. "I don't imagine you were." Something crossed his face at that. Pleasure, she thought, genuine and unguarded, and it was more moving than any calculated charm could have been, because it was real. She told him about the school in the East, about her mother and father back in Ohio, about the letters of introduction in her satchel and the reason she had come west, which was not only the teaching position, but a larger and less definable need to be somewhere that felt as though it still had room in it, as though the edges had not yet been fully determined. He listened with the same quality of attention he seemed to bring to the landscape, complete and unhurried and genuinely curious. "You are brave," he said when she had finished. "I don't feel brave," she said honestly. "That is what brave usually feels like," he said. She thought about that for a long time after she had gone back to her room at the schoolhouse, lying in her cot with the night wind moving through the territory outside her window. It struck her that she had known this man for less than a week and had spent perhaps 4 hours in his direct company, and yet the shape of him was already becoming necessary to her in a way that she could not rationally account for. She was a practical woman. She believed in measurable things, in evidence and reason, and yet, the following morning she began teaching and found that the children of Prescott were exactly what she had expected them to be, energetic and curious and resistant to arithmetic and endlessly distractible, and she loved every one of them for it almost immediately. She organized the schoolroom, established routines, wrote the alphabet on the board in her best hand. She was good at this, she knew. It was the right place for her. Eli came to the school at the end of the day. He stood at the door with his hat in his hands and asked if she had time for a walk. She did. They walked out along the road north of town, where the ponderosa pines began and the air smelled of pitch and open sky. And they walked without any particular destination and talked about everything and nothing. And somewhere in the course of that walk, Eleanor became aware that she was happier than she had been in a very long time, possibly happier than she had been in years, and that the happiness was specifically and irrevocably connected to the large, quiet man walking beside her. The next 3 weeks had the quality of something being built slowly and honestly, without haste and without pretense. Eli had, it turned out, winter trapping lines to tend north and west of Prescott, which gave him reason to be in and out of town, and he found reasons to be in town more than his trapping lines strictly required, which was a fact that he made no effort to conceal, and which Eleanor appreciated for its straightforwardness. He came to dinner at Mrs. Heller's twice a week. He brought her things from the high country, a spray of late-season wildflowers from a south-facing canyon wall, a piece of quartz crystal that caught the light like frozen water, a small brown hawk feather that he said came from the mesa top above the canyon where they had first met, which last item she pressed between the pages of her journal, with a care she would have found embarrassing to explain to anyone else. They walked often. The territory, which Eleanor was learning to read the way she had once read books, carefully, with increasing comprehension, finding new meaning in things that had initially seemed blank and featureless, was opening up to her through his eyes, and the process was dizzying. He showed her how to read the land, how the color of the rock told the age of it, how the angle of a dry wash told the direction of an old storm, how the tracks in the dust told the story of the previous night's silent commerce of animals. She was a quick student, which he registered without flattery, but with something that she recognized as pleasure. He was also, she was discovering, a man of considerable depth beneath the surface competence and physical enormity. He had read widely, in the scattered, opportunistic way of men who spend much time alone and prize books accordingly, and he had opinions about what he had read that were angular and original, and sometimes wrong, but always genuinely his own. He had a dry, quiet humor that revealed itself in such unexpected moments that she sometimes burst into laughter with a suddenness that startled them both. He was, she was becoming certain, the most interesting person she had ever met, and the realization that she was not only drawn to him but actively fascinated by him was both delightful and somewhat alarming in its intensity. He had not, in those 3 weeks, touched her. He had helped her down from a fence on one of their walks, and his hand around her wrist had been warm and certain, and she had felt the contact for the remainder of the afternoon. He had put a hand briefly at the small of her back once, guiding her past a loose board on a boardwalk, and she had been so physically aware of the warmth and weight of it that she had entirely lost the thread of what he had been saying. But he was courteous and measured, and she understood that this was not distance, but rather something closer to the opposite. A man who took seriously what was growing between them and who would not rush it or cheapen it. On a Saturday afternoon in late October, they rode out together to a limestone spring 5 miles north of town, where the water came clear and cold out of the rock into a shallow basin, and the cottonwoods were turning gold all around it. He had suggested it as a proper outing with horses, and she had borrowed a steady chestnut mare from the livery, and she was discovering that she was a tolerable rider and getting better, which he confirmed without condescension. They sat by the spring in the leaf-gold afternoon light and ate the cornbread and dried beef she had packed, and the horses drank, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a bird was going through its autumn song. It was so completely, achingly beautiful that Eleanor said nothing for a long time, only sat with her hands around her knees and watched the light on the water. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her, not at the spring, and his face was very open. All the usual careful, weathered composure had given way to something more direct and more vulnerable, and she was struck by the courage it must cost a man who had spent 5 years learning self-sufficiency to let himself be vulnerable at all. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean," he said, "so I want to be careful to say this exactly right." He paused, and the bird in the cottonwoods went on singing. "I am not sure I ever thought I wanted this kind of thing. A person to come back to. A reason to be somewhere specific." He looked at the spring, then back at her. "I find that I think about you every hour of every day that I'm away from this town. I find that this town has become the place I want to be, because you are in it. And I find that the life I was living, which seemed entirely sufficient to me before, now seems—" He stopped. "Smaller than I would like." Eleanor felt her throat tighten in a way that had nothing to do with unhappiness. "Eli," she said. "I am asking," he said quietly, "if you would consider spending time with me in a more formal way, with the intention of—" He stopped again, and there was something almost boyish in the pause, something entirely at odds with his size and his competence and his 5 years of solitary wilderness. And she found that she loved him for it with a completeness that took her entirely off guard. "I would like to court you properly, Eleanor, if you will allow it." She looked at him for a long moment and thought about the dark canyon and the cold campfire and the way the morning light had found his profile when he was watching the canyon at dawn, and the hawk feather pressed in her journal, and the way he listened to her, and the way she felt when she was walking beside him, as though the world had come slightly more clearly into focus. "I will allow it," she said. His breath came out slowly, and the tension in his shoulders released, and for the first time since she had known him, he smiled fully, without restraint, and it transformed his face entirely, the deep-set eyes crinkling at the corners, the weathered jaw softening, and it was so unexpectedly completely perfect that she laughed. "What?" he said. "You," she said. "You have faced 6 armed men in a dark canyon and tracked them alone for 3 days through wild country, and you are nervous to ask a schoolteacher if you may call on her." He looked at her with those deep, warm eyes. "The men in the canyon were something I knew how to handle," he said. "This is considerably less certain territory." She reached out and covered his hand with hers, and his fingers turned and closed around hers with a care that was also strength, and they sat like that by the spring in the cottonwood gold of the October afternoon. And Eleanor Voss thought that if the territory felt uncertain to him, it felt entirely and beautifully right to her. Winter came to the territory in November, not the crushing mountain blizzard of the northern ranges, but the desert winter of high elevation. Cold nights and brilliant days, the smell of pine smoke in the Prescott streets, frost on the schoolyard fence each morning that the children tracked inside on their boots. Eleanor had settled into the rhythm of the school with the confidence of someone who has found their vocation, and the children had settled into her with the careful affection of young people who recognize genuine interest in their teacher and are not accustomed to it. She taught them reading and arithmetic and geography, and she had begun, against the mild skepticism of the school board, a natural history program that consisted largely of walking outside and looking carefully at things which she had learned from a mountain man, and which was, she was convinced, the most valuable educational practice she had ever encountered. Eli came to town twice a week through November, dropping down from the high country on his bay horse with fresh pelts for the trading post and a habit of appearing at the schoolhouse door at the end of the day with the same hat-and-hands formality he had maintained since the beginning, which she found increasingly endearing. They took dinner at Mrs. Heller's, and they walked, and on Sunday afternoons they rode out together into the country. Marshall Aldrich nodded approvingly when he saw them on the street. Mrs. Heller took to setting a second cup at Eleanor's table before Eli arrived without being asked. Consuela Garza, who was still in Prescott visiting her sister and had become Eleanor's closest friend in the territory, told her frankly that she had never seen 2 people more obviously suited to each other and advised her not to be foolish about it. Eleanor had not needed the advice. She was not being foolish. She was being exactly as certain as she felt, which was entirely certain. One December evening, Eli came to dinner at Mrs. Heller's and was quiet through much of the meal, and Eleanor watched him and waited, because she had learned that he thought things through completely before he said them, and that the thinking was worth waiting for. "The marshal came out to my camp yesterday," he said finally. She set down her fork. "About the men you brought in?" "About the 6th man." He looked at her steadily. "The leader, the one with the pale eyes." She had not forgotten those eyes. She never would. They found him. He was taken 3 weeks ago down in the superstition country by a deputy from Globe. He had been using a different name and a different band of men, hitting wagon trains on the southern route. Eli's voice was even, but there was something in it. "He was tried in Globe last week. And?" "He will hang in January," Eli said quietly. "He and 2 others from his new outfit." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate. She was aware of something settling in her, some last piece of unfinished business finding its proper place, like a door that has been standing slightly open being gently, firmly closed. The pale, cold eyes in the canyon dark. The way he had looked at her. The way she had not been able to stop thinking about it in the weeks after, in the way that threats you cannot name continue to inhabit the back of the mind long after the moment of danger has passed. "It is over then," she said. "It is over," he said. She looked up at him, and there was such steady solidity in his face, such complete and uncomplicated assurance, that she felt the last of the cold canyon dark lift off her entirely. "Eli," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." She said it simply, without elaboration, and he understood precisely what she meant, all of it, the canyon and the fire and the morning watch and the 3 days in the hill country, and the steady, competent presence of him through all the weeks since, and he nodded once, and reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Mrs. Heller came by to refill the coffee cups and saw their joined hands and said nothing at all, which was, Eleanor reflected, a form of eloquence all its own. Christmas in Prescott was a community affair, with a gathering in the courthouse square on Christmas Eve where someone played fiddle and someone else played a battered upright piano that had been rolled out from the hotel on a flat cart, and the whole town came out in their best clothes in the cold, clear air with lanterns and cider and an excess of goodwill toward one another that the season, even in the territory, managed to produce reliably. The pine trees that had been cut and set up around the square were strung with paper decorations made by Eleanor's students, and she stood looking at them with the particular satisfaction of a teacher seeing her classroom's work in the world. Eli had come down from the high country 3 days before Christmas and had announced, with the same careful deliberateness he brought to everything, that he intended to winter in Prescott. There were practical reasons for this that he outlined briefly and convincingly, but Eleanor's eyes and Consuela's both said clearly that they understood the actual reason, and neither of them said so out loud, which was a kindness. He found her at the edge of the square on Christmas Eve, standing slightly apart from the main crowd, looking at the stars above the dark mountains. He came and stood beside her, and she was aware of the warmth of him in the cold air, the solid, immovable presence. "I have been thinking," he said. "I know," she said. "You've been thinking for about a week. I've been watching you." He looked at her, and that smile came again, the full one. "You notice things." "I learned it from a trapper," she said. He turned to face her fully, and his hands came up and held her face with extraordinary gentleness, those large, capable hands that had tended fires and tracked outlaws and carved a life out of difficult country, cradling her face as though she were something precious and fragile, which nobody had ever made her feel before, and which she found she very much liked. "I love you, Eleanor," he said. It had the same quality as everything he said, direct and complete and exactly what he meant, no more and no less. "I love you," she said. She had known it for weeks, and the saying of it was as natural as breathing. He kissed her in the cold night air of the territory, with the fiddle playing behind them, and the stars brilliant overhead, and the paper decorations made by her students turning gently in the mountain wind. And it was, Eleanor thought, with her last coherent thought for some time, the finest thing that had ever happened to her. The winter passed in a way that Eleanor had not anticipated winter could pass, quickly, warmly, full of the particular richness of a life that has acquired a new and necessary element. Eli had taken a room at the boarding house, and he was in town more than he was not, and the rhythms of their days together acquired the pleasant solidity of routine, her days at the school, his days at the trading post, or out running the shorter of his trap lines, evenings together at Mrs. Heller's table, or in the sitting room at the schoolhouse, where Mrs. Heller had provided an extra chair that had not been there before, and whose arrival Eleanor chose not to question. They talked endlessly about everything, the territory, the school, his childhood in Missouri, her childhood in Ohio, history and books and the nature of the land and the nature of people, and about the future, which was a subject they had begun approaching with increasing specificity and decreasing circumspection. In February, on a clear, cold afternoon when the sun was bright on the Red Rock hillside south of town and the air smelled of pine and thaw, Eli brought a horse to the schoolhouse at the end of the school day and told her he wanted to show her something. She locked the schoolroom and followed him out of town, south along the road, then off it onto a track she had not traveled before, climbing through pinon pine and juniper onto a bench of land above the valley. The bench was wide and level, with a view to the south and east that was breathtaking. Miles and miles of territory, the far mountains blue and white with snow, the valley below patterned with the bare trees of winter, Prescott itself visible as a collection of wooden squares and the glint of windows. The bench itself was sheltered from the north wind by a ridge of red rock, and in the afternoon sun it was genuinely warm. A small spring came out of the rock at the north end of the bench and ran in a thin, clear line across the level ground. He stood beside her and let her look at it for a while. "This is 160 acres, he said. "I filed the claim with the Territory Land Office in January." He paused. "The spring runs year-round. The south exposure means the ground warms early in spring. She turned and looked at him. "I have the timber skills to build a house," he said. "A proper house, not a trapper's cabin, with a room for a parlor and a room for a kitchen," and he stopped, and the vulnerability was there again, nakedly. "I have been building it in my head all winter, every detail of it." "Eli," she said softly. "I know you have your school," he said quickly. "I know that matters to you, and it should matter. It is important work, and this territory needs more people like you doing it. This bench is 4 miles from Prescott, which is not a great distance on horseback, and—" "Eli," she said again, more firmly. He stopped. She reached up and put her hand against his face, feeling the rough warmth of his jaw, the hard structure of his cheekbone, all that contained strength and contained feeling. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she said. He covered her hand with his. "Yes," he said, "I am." "Then yes," she said. He closed his eyes for a moment, and she felt the breath go out of him, and then he gathered her in against his chest with both arms and held her there in the February sun above Prescott, and she could feel the strong beating of his heart, and around them the territory stretched away in every direction, vast and old, and she was beginning to believe this completely, full of room for exactly the life she wanted. They were married in the spring. The ceremony was at the small church in Prescott on a Saturday in April, when the desert wildflowers were coming up through the red soil, and the air was so full of warm fragrance that Eleanor would remember it for the rest of her life as the smell of that particular joy. Marshall Aldrich stood up with Eli, a choice that seemed to say something about the nature of men who choose their friends from the ranks of those they respect, rather than those they have simply known longest. Consuela Garza stood with Eleanor and pressed her hand before the ceremony with such warm, fierce sincerity that Eleanor had to take several very deliberate breaths to maintain her composure. Eli wore a dark suit that he had clearly purchased new and which fit his enormous frame with improbable success, and he stood at the front of the church waiting for her with the expression of a man who has survived 5 years alone in the wilderness and has never once been as terrified as he was in that moment, which Eleanor found so completely endearing that she came up the aisle, smiling so broadly that the assembled congregation, who had collectively decided to regard this union as the most welcome event of the territorial spring, smiled back at her in a wave. He took her hands at the front of the church, and his hands around hers were warm and steady, and the look in his eyes was the deepest and truest thing she had ever seen directed at herself. And when the minister said the words and he said, "I do," he said them with the same quiet, absolute directness he brought to every true thing he had ever said. And Eleanor said, "I do," with every piece of herself she had. The celebration afterward was a community affair, which was the only kind of affair Prescott knew how to hold. Tables set up outside the courthouse with food, contributed by what seemed like every household in town, the fiddle player back on duty, and a general atmosphere of happiness that had nothing performed about it. Marshall Aldrich made a brief speech that was mostly about the value of capable men and honest women to a frontier community, which was somewhat unorthodox as wedding toasts went, but which was received with genuine warmth. Mrs. Heller cried openly and made no attempt to conceal it. Eli danced with Eleanor, carefully and somewhat stiffly, which was the one area in which his physical capabilities had not yet been fully developed, and she found his determined seriousness about the dancing so charming that she buried her face against his shoulder to hide her expression, and he bent his head and said quietly in her ear, "I will practice," and she laughed against the dark fabric of his suit and felt the low vibration of his laugh answering hers, and it was, she thought, the best possible beginning. They went back to the bench that evening, where Eli had built a temporary shelter against the rock face while the proper house was under construction. A solid structure of timber and canvas that was considerably more comfortable than it sounded, with a proper iron stove and a bed, and a window he had framed out of the rock wall so that she could lie in the bed and look out at the stars above the territory. Eleanor stood in the doorway of this temporary beginning of their life and looked out at the spring evening, the sky going deep purple above the red hills, the valley below beginning to show its lights as the town settled into night, and felt a contentment so complete it had a physical weight to it, warm and solid in her chest. His hands came to her shoulders from behind, and she leaned back against the wall of his chest. "Are you happy?" he said, low near her ear. "Unspeakably," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head, and they stood like that in the doorway of their beginning, looking out at the territory while the stars came out one by one until the night was full of them. The house took Eli the better part of the summer to build, working on it in the mornings before Eleanor left for the school, and on the afternoons when the work of the trapping lines was done, and on the long weekend days when they worked side by side, Eleanor handing him tools and mixing adobe and learning, under his patient instruction, more about the practical construction of shelter than she had previously known anyone could know. He had a trapper friend, a Scots-Irish man named William Farrow, who was wide and cheerful and completely unsuited to any silence whatsoever, who came and helped with the heavier framing work in July, filling the bench with cheerful noise and very bad jokes, and a willingness to work that made up for the noise and the jokes. Eli tolerated William's company with an affectionate exasperation that told Eleanor a great deal about what their friendship was built on, a shared history and difficult country that produced a loyalty between men that did not require constant articulation. The house was finished in September, a proper house of adobe and timber, with the parlor and the kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a porch on the south side that caught the sun all day long. It was not a grand house by Eastern standards, but it was solid and honest and built with extraordinary care, and Eleanor walked through it on the day it was finished, touching the walls and the window frames and the kitchen shelves that Eli had planned smooth with a care she would never have thought to demand, but which moved her deeply. And she thought that the quality of a house is in exact proportion to the quality of the intention that built it. In October, Eleanor discovered that she was going to have a child. She told Eli in the evening on the porch, with the sun going down behind the western hills and the valley below, catching the last gold light. She had been trying to find the moment all day, which was a new experience for a woman who was generally not afraid of words, and she sat beside him on the porch bench and finally simply said it. He was very still for a moment. She watched him carefully. Then he reached over and took her hand and held it, and when he turned to look at her, his face was entirely open in a way she had seen fully only a handful of times, on the day he had asked to court her at the spring in October at the front of the church, and in it was a joy so large and so poorly contained that it was almost painful to look at. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "I know," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles and held them there, and she watched the muscles in his jaw work and understood that this enormous man, who had survived 5 years alone in the territory and had walked alone into a canyon after 6 armed men, was undone by the news that she was carrying their child. "We are going to need a 3rd bedroom," she said. He laughed, a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, and pulled her against him, and she rested against the warmth and solidity of him with her head against his shoulder, and the territory lay below them in the October gold, and it seemed to Eleanor that the world had arranged itself at this particular moment into something remarkably close to perfection. She continued teaching through the winter with the school board's somewhat uncertain blessing. A teacher who was visibly expecting a child was not the territory's customary arrangement, but Eleanor made the argument that the children of Prescott needed their teacher more than the school board needed its conventions, and Marshall Aldrich said something brief and useful at the relevant meeting, and the matter was settled. She taught until March, when the baby was close enough to the present moment that even she admitted that walking 4 miles to school each morning was no longer practical. Their son was born on the 1st of April, 1876, which was a date that Eli said seemed to have been chosen by someone with a sense of humor, though he said it with the full version of his smile, the one that crinkled his eyes. The birth was attended by the town's doctor and by Consuela, who had by this point settled permanently in Prescott, having discovered that she preferred the territory to anything she had left behind. The baby was large and healthy and possessed, from the first moments, of his father's dark eyes and the same considering quality with which those eyes examined the world. They named him James, after Eli's father. Eli held his son for the first time with the same extraordinary care he brought to fragile and precious things, those big hands cradling James with a gentleness that made Eleanor's throat tighten. He stood by the window with the baby against his chest, and James looked up at the large face above him with those new dark eyes, and something passed between them that Eleanor observed with a love so full it had no room for anything else. "Hello," Eli said quietly to his son, as though they were being introduced. "Hello, James." The years that followed had the particular richness of lives built by intention and maintained by love. Eli expanded his work, less trapping as the seasons changed, more guiding and scouting for the survey parties that were moving through the territory, as the government began the serious business of mapping and understanding the land. He was much sought after by survey party leaders who quickly learned that a man who knew the territory as intimately as Eli Cord did was worth whatever he asked, which was always less than he could have charged, because he was not a man for whom the accumulation of money was the primary measure of a good day's work. Eleanor went back to the school in September, James being left with a cheerful neighbor woman on the days Eleanor taught. The school had grown with the town. Prescott was no longer quite the frontier settlement it had been when Eleanor arrived, though it retained the particular quality of a place still in the process of becoming itself. New families arrived regularly, bringing with them new students, and Eleanor pressed the school board for a second teacher and eventually got one, a young man named Peters who was entirely sincere about education and only slightly afraid of Eleanor, which she considered the appropriate level of healthy respect. She and Eli talked about everything they had always talked about, but now also about James, about watching him learn the world, about the particular astonishment of parenthood, which was nothing like Eleanor had expected, and everything she had hoped. They talked about the territory, which was changing. The railroad was coming, people said, and with it, change of a kind and pace that even the oldest settlers were uncertain about. They talked about the people they knew and the community they were part of, which was real and various and sometimes difficult and more often generous, and about the injustices that persisted in it, the treatment of the Apache people whose land all of this had been, the ways in which the law was applied unevenly depending on who was asking for it. And these were not comfortable conversations, but they were necessary ones, and Eleanor was grateful that she had married a man who did not avoid the things that were difficult, because they were difficult. When James was 3, Consuela married a rancher named Diego Reyes, who had land south of Prescott, and was a broad, kind man who looked at Consuela with the same uncomplicated devotion with which Eli looked at Eleanor. And the wedding was held on the bench above the town, and the whole community came. And it was one of Eleanor's happiest days, because Consuela deserved every joy the territory could offer her. When James was 4, Eleanor discovered she was expecting again. She told Eli on the porch in the evening in October, exactly as she had told him 4 years earlier, and his reaction was almost identical. The stillness, the open face, the jaw that worked, the eyes that were not quite dry. And she loved him so deeply for the constancy of his feeling that she pulled his head down to hers and kissed him before he had managed to say anything, and he made a muffled sound of protest that was entirely unconvincing. Their daughter was born in May of 1880, into a territory that was already beginning to fill in its edges. The railroad had arrived by then, the telegraph wires ran alongside the tracks, and the conversations in Prescott had begun to include words like development and incorporation in ways that signaled the end of one era and the beginning of another. They named her Clara, after Eleanor's mother, and she was fair where James was dark, and loud where James was quiet, and utterly fearless, in a way that Eli looked at with an expression of combined pride and alarm that Eleanor found deeply entertaining. James took to his sister with the solemnity of a 4-year-old who has been told he is now responsible for a small person and has taken the assignment entirely seriously. He brought her things, pebbles from the yard, a feather, a piece of bark with interesting texture, with the careful gravity of someone presenting important evidence. Clara accepted these offerings with the imperious satisfaction of someone who fully expected tribute. Eleanor watched them and thought that she had never in her life made anything as fine as these two particular people. Eli taught James to track before the boy was 6, taking him out on weekend mornings along the ridgeline trails above the bench, crouching beside him to show him the print of a deer or the scratch of a claw on a tree trunk, and James absorbed it with the same complete attention his father brought to everything. And Eleanor would sometimes look out the kitchen window on a Saturday morning and see the two of them moving together through the pinon and juniper, the large man and the small dark-haired boy, and feel her heart so full It seemed to press against her ribs. William Farrow came for a long visit in the summer of 1881 and spent 3 weeks on the bench, sleeping in the barn to his own expressed preference, filling the house with his relentless cheerful noise and eating everything Eleanor put in front of him with such wholehearted appreciation that she cooked more abundantly than she ever did otherwise. He and Eli sat on the porch in the evenings and talked in the low voices of men who have shared difficult things, and Eleanor and Clara sat nearby in the warm dark, and Eleanor listened to the murmur of that old friendship and was grateful for it, for what it said about who Eli was and where he had come from. One evening in the summer of 1882, Eli came in from the barn where he had been seeing to the horses and found Eleanor in the parlor reading by the lamp, with James asleep over a book of his own beside her, and Clara asleep in the armchair with her boots still on. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the scene, and Eleanor looked up and saw his face. "What?" she said softly. He crossed the room and sat beside her on the sofa, and she moved into the arm that came around her with the ease of long habit. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the sleeping children. "I was thinking," he said, "about Dark Canyon." She looked at him, waiting. "I came through there because it was the most direct route south," he said. "I had no particular reason to be going south. I'd finished a trapping run early and I was just—" He paused. "If I had waited one more day or taken the eastern pass, I would never have come through the canyon that night." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth of his arm, the familiar weight of him beside her. "Do you think about things like that often?" she said. "Sometimes," he said. "The narrowness of it. How close to nothing it came." She reached up and put her hand against his face, the way she had done on the bench in February 8 years ago with the territory spread out before them. His face turned into her hand the same way it always had, and she felt the long muscles of his jaw, the familiar roughness of his skin, and below all of it, the solidness of him, the great reliable bedrock presence that had been the constant of her life for all these years. "It did not come to nothing," she said. "No," he said. He turned his head and pressed his lips to her palm, that same gesture from the bench, from the beginning of everything. "No, it did not." James made a small sound in his sleep and shifted, and Clara's bootless foot dropped off the armchair arm with a thump that made them both look over, and Clara slept on with the magnificent unconcern of the deeply asleep, and they looked at each other above the children's heads, and something passed between them that needed no words. The full weight of the life they had made, the years and the seasons and the 1,000 ordinary days that were, taken together, the most extraordinary thing either of them had ever been part of. The years continued, as years do when they are good, not without difficulty, because the territory was still the territory and the work was still hard, and the winters could still be unforgiving, and there were seasons where the money was tight, and seasons where the weather was cruel to the livestock, and seasons where one or the other of the children was sick, with the kind of illness that makes parents lie awake counting breaths. But they were years full of the deep grain of a real life, textured and honest and built on something that had been tested at the beginning and had held. James grew tall, dark, watchful, his father's eyes in his mother's mind, a combination that his teacher at the school consistently reported as simultaneously her greatest pleasure and her greatest challenge, which Eleanor thought was the highest form of educational compliment. He was 17 in 1893 and already speaking of studying law in the East, of coming back to the territory to practice, because the territory needed lawyers who understood it, and he had been told since childhood, by his father who tracked prints in the dust and his mother who taught children to look carefully at the world, that understanding a thing was the beginning of being useful to it. Clara was 13 and entirely herself, a force of nature in miniature, who was simultaneously her mother's most thoughtful student and her father's most fearless riding companion, and who had at 11 informed the school board directly that the school books needed updating on the subject of natural history, a statement so startlingly accurate and so confidently delivered that the board had agreed before they quite knew what was happening. She was going to do something significant with her life, Eleanor was entirely certain, though she had not yet determined the specific shape of it, and Eleanor's job as her mother was not to determine that shape, but to make sure Clara had every tool she needed when the time came. On a fall evening in 1893, Eleanor stood on the south porch and watched the sunset over the territory. The view from the bench had changed over the years. There were more lights in the valley now, more roads visible in the landscape, more signs of the filling in that had been happening since the railroad came. But the mountains were the same mountains, and the sky above them was the same sky, and the air had the same cold pinyon pine smell that it had always had. And she had loved this place and this life for so long, now that it was simply part of her, as essential and unquestioned as the beat of her own heart. Eli came out and stood beside her, and he was 50 years old now, and the hair at his temples was going silver. And there were lines in his face that had not been there when she met him, but his shoulders were still the same shoulders, and his hands were still the same hands, and when he put his arm around her and pulled her in against his side, the warmth and the weight of it were exactly what they had always been, exactly right, exactly home. "Beautiful evening," he said. "Yes," she said. Below in the valley, the lights of Prescott were coming on one by one in the blue dusk, and the mountains to the south were going pink and gold, and then, as the sun dropped lower, a deep settled purple, and the first star appeared above the eastern ridgeline, and then another, and then the sky began its nightly extravagance, turning from blue to black and filling with light. Eleanor thought about a dark canyon and a cold campfire, and a man who had appeared out of the dark with a long rifle and quiet eyes, who had sat across a fire from her and kept the dark at bay with no drama and no noise, who had walked alone into the hills after 6 dangerous men because it was the right thing to do, who had asked her if he could court her with his hat in his hands and a vulnerability in his face that made her love him on the spot, who had built her a house with his own hands and held their children with a gentleness that was the inverse of his strength and the truest thing about him, who had spent 20 years being the constant, certain gravity of her life. She reached up and took the hand on her shoulder, lacing her fingers through his. "I was thinking about Dark Canyon," she said. He looked down at her, and the smile came, the full one, the one she had been the cause of for 20 years, the one she would never in her life grow tired of. "Were you?" he said. "I am glad Tom Briggs was a bad shot," she said. Eli laughed, low and genuine, the laugh she had loved from the first time she heard it. "He was not a bad shot," he said. "He was a careful man. He knew better than to fire in a narrow canyon in the dark." "I know," she said. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I am glad for everything that happened exactly as it happened, every piece of it, the timing of it, the narrowness of it, all of it." His arm tightened around her, and he pressed his lips to the top of her head. "As am I," he said quietly. "As am I, Eleanor." Inside the house behind them, they could hear Clara moving in the kitchen with the confident noise of a 13-year-old girl who takes up precisely the amount of space she is entitled to. And from the direction of James's room, there was the small sound of pages turning. He read at night by lamplight until Eleanor told him to sleep, and even then continued, and she had given up telling him. Outside, the horses in the small barn were making the companionable sounds of horses settling for the night. The wind moved through the piñons on the ridge above the bench, the same wind it had always been, speaking the same low language it had spoken across this high country for centuries, before either of them was born, and would speak for centuries after. Eleanor stood with her husband in the cool fall dark above the valley they had made their home, and she was warm, and she was certain, and she was exactly where she wanted to be, which was here, with him, in this specific and irreplaceable life. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.